Hi everyone, this is Dragon GGY, and this is the operator Hindsight for the new limited operator Virtuosa. Virtuosa is a 6-star Ritualist under the supporter class. This is also a very new archetype introduced to the game a few months ago along with the friendly elemental damage. And Ritualist is the first piece of puzzle to this new mechanism. They have the same attack range as these old binders, and their trait attack deals arts damage and can inflict elemental impairment. Now, due to the official translation doing a misleading job, I have to use an unofficial term for this, which I will explain in just a bit. Before everything, I will quickly reveal how friendly elemental damage works. The most confusing part would lie in the terms. First of all, we have elemental impairment. This is the damage dealt to elemental HP, abbreviated as EHP. EHP is displayed as the ring above the actual HP bar. There are different types of element and thus elemental impairment. Currently in the game for CN we have 2 types of them, but potentially we will get all 4 from elemental damage from enemy in the future. Generally in game they will be referred to as the specific type of element damage. So Virtuosa, for example, deals necrosis damage, and necrosis damage itself is a type of elemental impairment. This is very easily confused with elemental damage. Elemental damage is actual damage to HP. It is the 4th type of damage in Arknights after physical, arts, and true damage. And because of that, you should get it by now that it only has 1 type. It's just what it is. Currently in the EN game, both elemental impairment and elemental damage got translated into the same name of elemental damage, which is why I have to resort to using the old term impairment so that you don't get confused. Next we have elemental burst. Previously on my channel I referred to it as elemental fallout. It is the state in which EHP of an enemy has been depleted and is now recovering. During burst, the enemy does not take elemental impairment and will suffer from an effect and duration related to its type of element. Therefore, there are different types of elemental bursts, and we refer to them with the elemental name, for example, necrosis burst. Enemy EHP mechanism is very straightforward. If you are not a boss, you have 1000 EHP. If you are a boss level enemy, you have 2000 EHP. So in some sense, elemental damage is inherently a solution to the elite enemies, because unlucky for them, their EHP is just as easy to be depleted as normal grunts. Some quick bullet points. Each type of impairment has its own EHP bar or ring, but only the most damaged one will be displayed. Once the elemental burst of one element is triggered, so you depleted that EHP, all EHP rings will then be locked out and reset. The conclusion should then be clear that different elements do not have interactions. They are not even parallel, they are competitive. So you should not use operators who deal different types of elemental impairment together. Finally, let's talk about resistance stats related to the element mechanism. We have 2 types of stats added to the game back when it was introduced. First one is impairment resistance, which is currently referred to in the EN game as effect resistance. It is a reduction to elemental impairment taken by percentage, so less damage to the ring. The other one is elemental resistance. It's a reduction to elemental damage taken by percentage, so less damage to the bar. However, as of now, all enemies in the game have 0 in both of these properties in CN. So yes, you can take it as a slightly different true damage. So back to Ritualist. A Ritualist operator only deals a specific type of elemental impairment. Therefore, aside from the archetype Ritualist, they have another hidden tag to them. And for Virtuosa, it's Necrosis Ritualist. Necrosis, as an element, its burst effect is that enemy would take 800 elemental damage per second and is inflicted with a 50% enfeeble, which means attack decrease that gradually recovers back to 100% over the burst duration, which is 15 seconds. In other words, during a cooldown of 15 seconds, it's 800 E DPS for a total E damage of 12k. It also provides short-term survival support by debuffing the enemy, but the gradual recovery is a bit silly because it's not really controllable and thus not reliable. It helps, but you can't depend your life on it. Now we can dig deep into Ritualist. There are a few characteristics to them. When the trait says they can inflict impairment, it's achieved by talents or skills. The auto attack from Ritualist does not inflict elemental impairment. Second is that they deal impairment based on their attack stats, not affected by defense or arts resistance or the majority of damage reductions. However, they do not deal elemental damage directly. It's all coming from the effects of elemental bursts itself. If you compare this to Primal Caster and Archetype introduced alongside Virtuosa, or Ebenholt's or Logo's Delta module, we can see the difference in their designs and get an idea of what they're good at respectively. Module for Ebenholt's and Logos allows them to deal impairment with auto attacks, but for him and Primal Caster, when they deal impairment, it's based on percentage of damage dealt, which means it has to go through resistance and damage reductions, and that obviously is inferior to Ritualists. However, they are able to directly deal elemental damage while their target is in elemental burst, which is a damage window opened by Ritualists. Therefore, it's easy to see why Ritualists are in supporter class. They are designed to induce elemental burst effectively, and then to open up an output window for the actual elemental damage dealers. Next, let's go through both of Virtuosa's talents because they are closely linked. Talent 1, enemies within attack range, takes necrosis damage. Again, this refers to impairment, equal to 10% of attack and inflicted with slow for 0.2 seconds every second. Talent 2 increases the necrosis damage taken by enemies within attack range by 20%, 22% at potential 5. First of all, Talent 1 itself enjoys the effect of Talent 2, so she deals 66.8 necrosis damage per second to enemies in range at potential 5 or above, and 63 at potential 3 or below. The reason I'm bringing up potentials here is that because both attack increase, which is at potential 4, and the Talent 2 improvement at potential 5 will impact the time to trigger burst for Virtuosa. For potential 5 or above, it's 15 seconds for non-boss enemy and 30 seconds for boss. Potential 3 or below would be 16 seconds and 32 seconds respectively. Not saying that it was a lot, but it's one of the rarer cases where potentials are a bit more noticeable on performances. But I'll also prove that it's not that game changing either later in this video, so sit tight for that. 0.2 seconds slow every second is effectively 16% movement speed reduction in range, which to be honest is barely noticeable in the game. For reference, Ambusher X module gives 20% movement speed reduction. Therefore, it's not very strong in terms of just crowd control, but it does help to keep enemies in range for a couple more necrosis ticks from Talent 1. Another thing about Talent 1 is that it makes Virtuosa less impacted by attack speed debuffs by having a fixed tick every second. It also gives her true AoE, everyone in range is affected, and it makes an enormous difference because she's supposedly a single target operator, but the talent gives her AoE cleave that will prove even stronger with her skills. Talent 2 is very crucial for increasing Virtuosa's speed at building up impairment, which eventually leads to necrosis burst. Because the 15-second burst duration is fixed, saving more time on build up is the only way to shorten the cycle. Here's a summary for her skills. My take is Skill 3 Mastery 3 and Skill 1 Mastery 3. Although depends on personal preference, and then Skill 2 Mastery 3. Her skills have a diversified design and, in my opinion, is the most M9 worthy character since Yato Alter. Skill 1 deals 300% of attack as arc damage and 110% of attack as necrosis damage to an enemy who is not in elemental burst, can store 3 charges, does not auto attack. This is a 18/6, which means 3 stacks immediately available on deployed, pseudo power strike skill, except there's no normal strike. DPH doesn't really matter, so let's take a look at the necrosis damage per hit. It's 693 for lower potentials, which means that 3 stacks are guaranteed to trigger necrosis burst for bosses, and it's not gated by potential. My take is that Skill 1 is actually a delicately designed skill that is obviously very friendly to AFK, but also pretty good in general use against one or few targets. The fact that she does not auto-attack actually means that she won't be locked out by the animation when her skills is ready like the traditional power strike skills, and can cast them immediately. It also does not select targets already in burst to make sure they do not go to waste, and she can stack them up if there are no other targets and do a rinse and repeat when the target recovers from burst. It also has a good interaction with the talent one, so as we saw from the stats, each skill deals around 700 necrosis damage to the target, so when you pull 2 stacks on the same target, it's always a bit of an overkill. But the fact is, during off skill, her talent 1 assists in chipping away part of the enemy's EHP ring. Her talent 1 deals about 60 per second, right? So to fill up that 300 gap, it only takes 5 seconds. Perfectly suited to her 6 SP cycle. So in actual practice, oftentimes you'll find that she can burst each enemy with just 1 skill use. And this also adds to her ability to deal with more enemies, but just 2 or 3 more max. If there are more and they move fast, it wouldn't be ideal anymore. Finally, because of how efficient it would be if she always bursts a target with 1 stack of skill, skill 1 has quite a buff significance. You can do it with attack buffs or the Spinnic relics in IS. A very notable combo is actually Sculptor skill 2, and it does not require potential for both of them to make it possible. Next, we have skill 2, attack speed plus 60, attacks 2 targets. When Virtuosa and the allied operator with the highest attack within the attack range deals damage to an enemy, additionally deals 25% of Virtuosa's attack as necrosis damage. This is a 14/24 20-second skill. Attack speed plus 60 translates to 1 second interval for herself, so by her own plus her talent 1, it's a guaranteed burst in 5 seconds. Let's quickly go over how it works. It checks for the buff target every 0.3 seconds or when a new operator is deployed in range. The buff does not go to summons like Monster or devices like Pasiamka's Typewriter. It only buffs operators. The necrosis damage enchantment, let's just call it that, applies to every damage instance, so it generally pairs well with kits that do multi-hits in one attack, damage over time, or mixed damage, which is a type of multi-hit in itself. The amount of necrosis damage dealt is based on Virtuosa's attack stat and is not related to the buff receiver at all. Skill 2 is a short cycle fast recovery skill. High coverage allows her to work with other skills, which is what this skill is mostly about. It does only cost 1 burst during skill, but it still brings an overall higher burst coverage than skill 3. Now let's dive deeper into the enchantment part. It's convenient and unique because it works with skills that extend beyond her range, or those that can do multiple instances of damage quickly. Note that there are some kits that do not work for skill 2. Number 1 being DOT with non-traceable source, like Blue Poison Talent, Ethan skill 1, and Holderer skill 3. Also, for most operators with summons, their summons do not get the necrosis enchantment even when the operator get it themselves. I'm gonna put down some notable synergies for this skill. First of all, Marksman with multi-hit kits like Axia, Akito, etc. Spectre Altar's substitute lasts for 20 seconds, which is exactly the same as skill 2, which also comes with AoE, Arts DOT, and movement speed reduction to make sure everyone is bathing in phantom pain. Golden Glow skill 3 can do full map strike, each attack deals 3 instances of necrosis, and drone exploding will trigger an AoE spread. Ling's skill 3 is the only special case for summons because the Arts DOT of skill 3 traces back to Ling herself, therefore can be enchanted. Scar the Altar skill 3, which deals AoE true damage DOT combined with Virtuosa skill 2, is a strong penetration to groups of high defense or resistant enemies. And finally, we have Reed Altar skill 3. The Cinder DOT will trigger Necrosis Tick. Triggering burst can help taking down enemies faster, which causes explosion that spread both the Cinder and Necrosis. Finally, let's take a look at skill 3. Stops attacking, attack range expands, attack plus 180%. The talent 2 effect increases to 2.5 times. During skill, another operator in range with the highest max HP or attack or defense will gain plus 30% to that stat individually. This is a 40/60 40-second skill. The extended range is the same as Suzerain's skill 3, which is very handy. With this skill, Virtuosa gives up her own damage, which is good news, and focus on amplifying her talent set to create an AoE necrosis field. The time it takes to trigger burst for non-boss units is 5 seconds, and 9 seconds for boss units, and it's the same with or without related potentials, which is also nice. So let's go over the pros and cons for skill 3. It's an AoE, fast necrosis damage build-up in a really big range. 40-second duration is enough for 2 necrosis bursts. It has good resilience against attack debuffs, even with the most common half of attacks risk in CC. She can still manage to trigger 2 bursts for non-boss units during skill 3. Beyond that, she's literally not affected by attack speed debuff at all. For cons, this skill has a somewhat awkward cycle. It has a slow startup of 20 seconds, so not ideal for Halidrop. It also has a long recovery of 60 seconds, which is also not the best for continued presence, considering she doesn't do much without her skill. Other than that, the max HP, attack, and defense boost from the skill is just somewhat trivial. It's a minor buff that has quite the duration, but not really the reason to use this skill. For synergy, with the current lack of Primal caster who coordinates in damage, the most standout synergy turned out to be with Suzerain. First of all, although not perfect, their skill 3 has a pretty good relay, which creates a high crowd control coverage. Suzerain provides the SP recovery that shortens Virtuosa's skill 3 downtime to 43 seconds. Her stronger slow also helps Virtuosa to better take advantage of her AoE necrosis damage. So after all these talks about skills and how they are M9 worthy, let's summarize where they're good in respectively. Skill 1, an AFK skill that works perfect in daily stages, especially strong against a single target. The skill is designed so that you can Halidrop her for an instant burst, and it's sensitive to attack buffs that helps her reach the threshold where one skill use is enough to trigger burst. However, this is also her weakest skill against enemy hordes. Skill 2 is the skill that has the most flexible timings, making it easier to pair up with other skills for higher burst coverage. This skill is all about working with other units, and it's best when you combo it with skills I've mentioned. But outside of those combos, when Virtuosa is mostly using it for her own, it's still not the best against hordes because it doesn't prioritize enemies outside of burst. Skill 3 is unique in its ability to do AoE cleave in a big range causing necrosis outbreak. It's best against big waves of mobs or those enemies formations consisting of high defense, high resistant units but stay in place for long. The main problem with the skill being having a long startup and recovery, so the downtime is massive considering her limited impact outside of skills. So to conclude, as a 6-star Ritualist, Virtuosa is no doubt the most effective necrosis burst inducer up to date. She has a diversified skill set design that works with different teammates and skills and suits different scenarios depending on enemy type and number. To review Virtuosa, we have to consider from the scope of the whole elemental system. Damage side of things, the damage from herself is close to neglectable. Most of them come from necrosis burst, but even that, it's just 800 DPS over 15 seconds. On the flip side though, elemental damage is effectively true damage as of now, so that's high quality damage and it's AoE. For what we expect from a supporter, that's at least respectable. Then let's think of elemental damage now and in the future. Good news for Virtuosa, judging from how specialized a 6-star necrosis Ritualist is, she's likely to stay as the best in this field for some good time. The guaranteed 12k damage from necrosis burst is also sufficient for daily or even hardcore contents to kill off mobs, and mechanically provides her with good resilience against attack or attack speed debuffs compared to other damage units. However, a good protection is also a shackle. The fixed 12k damage do not benefit from buffs, at least just yet, and has a 15-second built-in cooldown. Not to mention different types of elements are competitive, which placed a limit to what she can do as a necrosis Ritualist. And finally, the other half of the puzzle, 6-star Primal caster, or specifically necrosis Primal caster, has yet to be released, so it's hard to tell what her future value would be. and I will focus on what she's achieved so far for you to judge. Her current key values: number 1, an easy workaround for all the high defense, high resistance, and high damage reduction enemies, which is becoming more and more prevalent in the game right now. Number 2, her resilience against enemy defensive buffs, barring max HP buffs, and friendly offensive debuffs is an advantage for her in the hardcore context. Here I made a demonstration. This is from the latest CC battle plan Underdawn. The Seaborn mob after-attacks have 7.5k HP and 900 defense. Yato Alter skill 2 without debuffs should do 15k damage to it, but after the attack debuff of minus 50%, she now only deals 4.8k, which becomes insufficient for the kill. Against the Seaborn Slapper, who has 90 resistant after attacks, Aya skill 3 with module should still be able to take it down, but the damage is halved off after the same attack debuff. What we get from this is that physical damage is highly susceptible to attack debuffs. Having attack brings more than 50% damage decrease for physical dealers and half off for arts and true damage. However, for Virtuosa, she only gets a half off to her necrosis damage per stack with skill 1, and Hella dropping with 3 stacks can still instantly trigger a burst, which translates to the same 12k damage, enough to kill up both of the enemy we just mentioned. So that's where the high quality damage as well as resilience we just talked of came from. 12k damage is not much, but it's devastating enough for mobs or just enemies who are tough but with low HP in general. And last but not least, she can do this to everyone in a big range, with some slight CC as cherry on top. So looking at her performances in common events, you'll realize that she's full of medals. Skill 1 is a new AFK option for those concerned. On her first CC debut, she gets to be in the highest risk roster for the first CC battle plan, which is coming for global in 2 weeks. She's the number 1 supporter starter in IS4 and dominates the first 2 floors. She's an efficient boss solution in the upcoming CNY event where damage reduction is involved. Surprisingly, she also chops down trees with her music fairly efficiently in RA. And finally, she's also able to get a notable performance in CC Battle Plan Underdawn, bypassing the dodge mechanisms and the ridiculous defense. To conclude, Virtuosa is a 6-star necrosis ritualist who is very good in her own job and brings good countermeasure that is easy to use and applicable to almost all players. The ratings have been redistributed from the last episode. She might not be unique doing what she can do in daily, but her performance in the past 2 contingency contracts has proven her value in the current state of the game. I give her a daily rating of 5. Pros are that she's AFKable with efficiency enough for daily contents with skill 1, she brings fun and most importantly useful interaction with other operators with skill 2. She has a big AoE cleave with skill 3 and elemental damage as a mechanism, and so-called pseudo-true damage is an easy to use cheat against increasing amount of damage reduction mechanisms. However, as a counter-argument, it is legit to say that all these flashy mechanisms are replaceable with actual strong damage dealers, which is very true for daily content. And at the end of the day, 12k fixed damage with a 15-second cooldown, high quality yes, but not really high quantity. For advanced, I rate her at 8. Bypassing the bloated defense, resistance, and damage reduction in hardcore content is really crucial, especially in CC, where specific enemies get giga buffed, yes, but most other units remain disposable in 1 necrosis burst, if not 2. So it makes Virtuosa effective at dealing with them, which may take tons of effort for other operators to do the same. She's also not too impacted by attack or attack speed debuffs, if at all. However, her biggest enemy is max HP buffs. 12k HP and 12.1k HP can be the difference between 1 or 2 bursts. And for enemies with a few 100,000 HP, it's simply not something she can deal with, which is also the reason she gets weaker as you progress in IS due to the enemies climbing HP in later floors. Then finally, no one knows just yet how she would perform supporting a 6-star necrosis Primal caster. You can kinda get a glimpse of it looking at Delta modules, but to them, having Virtuosa as support is pretty close to using Suzerain, with Virtuosa having the edge for enemies with higher resistance. For Primal casters, yes, their elemental damage takes up a higher proportion of their total damage, so we can't tell just yet how much of an advantage Virtuosa could have as a dedicated support. Also, the relationship between Ritualist and Primal caster is not completely collaborative. If the Primal caster can also reliably cause Necrosis Burst, that in itself is competitive with what Virtuosa can do, because the 12k damage from Burst is mutually exclusive. It's accounted for by one of them, not both of them. That's the uncertainty of this situation. And finally, we have the preview of my pool recommendation for the coming 6 months. After the 5th anniversary banner, the overall ranking has been changed quite a lot. The introduction of Visage certainly shook up the damage dealer meta, especially physical. Make your moves accordingly, we're just 6 months away. While we look at all these, I'm gonna briefly talk about Logos because he has a Necrosis module and he's by far the caster that works with Virtuosa the best. The thing with their combo is that for grunts, either they can be killed just by Virtuosa triggering burst, or they are dead by Logos before the burst even happens, so the combo should mostly be reserved for tackling elites and bosses with high HP pool, where the burst itself is not enough, or when Logos himself can't efficiently trigger burst due to resistance or damage reduction. But still, the improvement given by Virtuosa to Logos is still fairly close to Suzerain, and again, Logos, for how strong he is competitive with Virtuosa in certain sense. If I can reliably do damage and finish off with successful Necrosis Burst, why would I still need a support then? That's it for this episode. Sorry again for being late, and I hope it's enough information to break down what this character can do. I'll see you in the Viviana video. Bye bye.